I am sort of the resident speaker for the microbes at the Center for Limnology at UW-Madison. You know, you hear about the Lorax speaking for the trees. I speak for the microbes, and I try to advocate that they are the coolest, most information-rich and biodiversity-rich group of organisms on the planet, and everybody should be studying them. The problem is that we can't look at a glass full of water from Lake Minocqua and see those microorganisms and count their legs or see what color fur they have. And so it becomes really difficult to wrap our brains around, you know, what kind of species are there. We certainly have even more trouble figuring out what they do in the lake. So we have this big challenge of not being able to see them, not being able to easily categorize them into groups, or to be able to see what they eat or what they're doing. Yet we know that they're providing these really important functions because we can measure some of those parameters, those functions, by doing certain kinds of experiments with lake water. But trying to assign those things that we know that they're doing to different species is really, really difficult. And so one thing that we've started doing in the past 5 to 10 years, sort of we as a community of researchers who study microorganisms that live in all kinds of different habitats, is just sequencing their DNA. So we can go and take a glass of water from Lake Minocqua and we can sequence all of the DNA in it. We can look at every last little piece of DNA in it. And we can tell when we do that sort of what kinds of organisms we've seen before, what kinds we've never seen before, and we can kind of start to group them into sets of organisms that we think are performing different kinds of functions. So one of the things that we're finding by looking at the DNA of these organisms is that they actually function more like a superorganism. So you can track each individual species as a unit, but it itself can't do everything that it needs to do in order to survive or to reproduce and be a living organism. It depends on its neighbor to provide some essential function. So probably the best example is making a vitamin, right? We all need other organisms to provide certain vitamins for us, right? Either the organisms in our guts or it's in our food that's produced by an animal. Same goes for the communities of bacteria that live in Lake Minocqua. They are depending on each other to provide different intermediates that they need for their growth. So if you try to take any one of them and grow them in a flask in the laboratory, it doesn't work because they need their friends around. This is one reason why they're so hard to study, is because we can't separate them and we can't do the kinds of experiments that most microbiologists or most biologists would do on an organism in order to figure out how they work. So some of the biggest research frontiers now are trying to figure out how this superorganism collection of individual organisms function, how they change through time, how they respond to conditions that we know happen on a seasonal time scale. So when the water warms up, when it rains and there's an influx of phosphorus or some form of nitrogen, how do they respond? If you suddenly have a season where the lakes don't freeze anymore, how are the organisms going to respond to that? So I will see if we have any questions now that I've given you some food for thought.
How do you identify what a microbe can eat and what it breathes?
So some of the techniques that are being developed now are using isotopes of elements. So sometimes they're radioisotopes, so a radioactive form of carbon or a radioactive form of phosphorus or something like that. But then there's also stable isotopes, which are not radioactive, but you can trace. Probably the best example is carbon that is, it's called C13. So carbon normally would have a molecular weight of 12, but if it has a molecular weight of 13, you can differentiate it from the normal carbon. And so if you give a particular community of bacteria sugar that has C13 carbon in it, you can track that C13 in individual cells using a certain kind of microscope and see which cell ate it. So if you look at the DNA sequence, you can see a gene that the organism had, and it's probably related, it might be related to something that another organism has that has been studied in great detail. E. coli, even though it's the one that makes you sick and everybody knows about for beach closings, also is the lab rat of microbiology. And a tremendous amount of research has been done on E. coli. And so we know that E. coli can breathe nitrate, and we know what genes it uses to do that. And so if we see a gene from a bacteria in Lake Minocqua that is maybe 60% identical to the one in E. coli, then we can start to predict that that's what it's for.
A lot of lakes up here have Eurasian water milfoil. They chemically treat it. Have any studies been done on what kind of effect the chemicals might have on the rest of the bacteria that are there?
I think general studies are often done just to make sure that a chemical doesn't completely inhibit breakdown of dead things, right? So if you put the chemicals in and then nothing happens, it like just stays and nothing happens, then you'd be a little bit worried, right? But usually, I mean, by the time it's approved to be used in an actual lake, someone has done the experiment to show that it doesn't stop the bacteria from doing that job of breaking it down.
How far are we away from actually manipulating the microorganisms to benefit us?
I don't think we understand the fundamental interactions of the organisms or how they respond to environmental change enough to be able to manipulate them. There are some microbiologists who are really excited about a field called synthetic biology, where basically you can build your own life form. You can make a microbe from scratch almost, or you can certainly take an existing microbe and reprogram it to vast extent. But the ethical issues of whether you would release a microbe like that into a lake are, I think that there's so much that we would need to try to understand before we would ever do that.
Do microbial communities change week to week or month to month or decade to decade?
When I started as a professor, we didn't know that. I'd say now we have a really good handle on the time scales that they change on. So they are very seasonal. In a lake, if you go out in May, the organisms that are there are really different from the organisms that are there in October. And we know that they change on probably like 4 to 7 day time scale. So that means the graduate students have to be out there about once a week taking samples in order to capture that variation.
How long do microbes live?
I've asked really famous microbiologists this question, and nobody ever really gives me an answer because I don't think anybody ever really, it's really hard to study that. Because certainly in a lake, the problem is that a virus comes along and kills it before it just ages. Like, does a bacterial cell age, I think is the question that I've always had. And I don't think they have a chance to age. I think they get killed by a virus, they get eaten by something else, maybe they get damaged by sunlight, and so maybe you could argue that's aging because they're getting oxidatively damaged, kind of the way our skin gets damaged and skin cells get damaged. But usually it's some kind of mortality that's coming from an external force rather than they don't really wear out. They usually die by predation or some chemical stress.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Trina McMahon.
Thank you.